The ballroom of the Hartwell Grand Hotel gleamed in white and gold. Crystal chandeliers hung above silk-covered tables. Waiters moved silently through the crowd. Every year, the city's most respected families gathered at the Winter Charity Gala to give and be seen. I had attended 12 times as Adrian's wife. I had helped plan more than half of these evenings without asking for credit. I wore a navy evening gown. My hair was up. My smile was practiced. I arrived alone because Adrian texted saying he would meet me there. That was no longer unusual. We had been living like strangers sharing a kitchen, careful not to discuss what was slowly breaking between us. When I walked through the entrance, I saw him immediately. Adrian stood near the center of the room looking more relaxed than he had in months. He was laughing. Beside him, her hand resting on a visibly rounded stomach, stood a woman I had never seen before. She looked young. She looked comfortable. She looked like she belonged there entirely. Someone near the registration table caught my eye. Mr. Nwosu, our family attorney, stood holding a sealed leather folder. He nodded once slowly. My heart did not race. Settled. People often asked how I stayed calm under pressure. The answer was simple. 14 years of carrying weight quietly had trained me. When Adrian and I married, he was charming and full of plans far larger than his income. I believed in him the way you believe in a garden you planted yourself. You water it, protect it, and wait for what grows. In our early years, my communications career provided the steady income that covered most household expenses, while Adrian chased investors for his property development business. He had real talent for presenting ideas but was less skilled at managing the money those ideas attracted. I filled the gaps without complaint. I organized his meetings and entertained his clients. I introduced him to contacts from my own professional networks who became his most loyal investors. He thanked me in private. In public, he presented himself as entirely self-made. I did not resent it then. I told myself a strong marriage meant building something together even when credit was shared unevenly. But somewhere between year 8 and year 10, the distance between us grew, and I started noticing things I had been too trusting to look for before. My friend Adrian was the first to hint something was wrong. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday morning in February, 10 months before the gala. Reviewing our shared household account, I found 3 transfers I did not recognize. Each was a round number. Together they were substantial. I read the amounts twice and felt something cold move through me. The reference codes meant nothing to me. I checked the dates. All 3 occurred during the 2 weeks Adrian told me he was in Abuja for a land acquisition deal. I had not questioned that trip. I had packed his bags myself. I tried to find explanations, but the part of my mind that had been quietly collecting worries for 2 years refused to let this go. I did not confront him immediately. I had learned from watching how power moves inside a marriage that timing matters more than reaction. I wrote the reference codes in a small notebook in my office drawer. 3 weeks later, I found 2 more unexplained transfers. That was the moment I stopped making excuses. I pulled out the notebook and added the new amounts beside the old ones. The numbers told a story. Not a story of carelessness or oversight, but of someone who had decided at some point that I would never look closely. When I asked Adrian about the transfers, I chose a Sunday evening after dinner. The house was quiet. I poured us both tea and sat across from him at the kitchen table as if we were simply talking about our week. I slid the bank statement across and pointed to the highlighted lines without speaking. He looked at the paper, then at me. Something shifted in his face. Not guilt exactly, but the specific annoyance of someone caught doing something they considered private business. I moved the money for a project, he said flatly. I did not think I had to explain every transaction to you. I told him calmly the money came from our shared account and that asking seemed reasonable. He stood and his voice rose. He said I was controlling, that I had always struggled to trust him, that this was the exact problem with our marriage. Conversation flipped completely. He was no longer explaining the transfers. He was explaining what was wrong with me. I did not shout back. I finished my tea and said goodnight. But walking upstairs, something inside me made a quiet, firm decision. I was no longer going to assume the best about things I could see clearly in front of. In public, Adrian and I continued to look exactly as we always had. We attended dinners, stood in photographs, and spoke warmly to other couples about our plans. If anything, Adrian became more attentive in front of others, touching my shoulder at events, making sure no one had reason to look too closely. But behind the scenes, he was building a quiet story about me. I heard it first from a business associate's wife at a lunch I attended alone. She said something careful and kind. Kind of thing people say when passing a warning without wanting blame. She told me some people had been saying I was going through a difficult emotional time, that I had grown distant, and that Adrian was privately worried about me. I thanked her and smiled. On the inside, I catalogued every word. He was laying groundwork. He was ensuring that when the time came, people would already have a version of me prepared. A woman who was emotionally unstable. A wife who had withdrawn. Someone whose word could not be fully trusted. One evening, passing his study, I heard him say quietly into the phone, "Everything will soon belong to us, just be patient." He did not hear me stop outside that. Mr. Nwosu had been our family attorney for 11 years. He was a quiet man who chose words the way a surgeon chooses instruments, precisely and without waste. When I met him privately, I told him everything I had found. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he removed a copy of our prenuptial agreement from his drawer. I had insisted on a prenup before our wedding. Adrian called it unromantic and said it showed a lack of faith. I held firm, and he eventually signed. What he never did was read it carefully. Mr. Nwosu pointed to a specific section and explained plainly that the agreement contained an infidelity clause. If ongoing unfaithfulness was documented and legally verified, certain asset protections in my favor would activate immediately. Beyond that, any property purchased using funds traceable to my personal contributions was subject to a separate ownership clause that had never been dissolved. He looked at me over his glasses. "Mrs. Hart, you structured this agreement wisely. Question now is whether we can build sufficient documentation before you need it." I told him I had already started. He opened a fresh notepad. We spent 2 hours reviewing every piece of evidence I had gathered, building a timeline together and identifying. Her name was Zara. I did not learn this until later, but I can now trace her story clearly. She was 26, ambitious and bright. She had met Adrian at a private investment seminar 8 months before the gala. He had approached her with the full confidence of a man presenting a version of himself built specifically to impress. He told her things. That our marriage was a formality. That we had not been close in years. That he was staying only for appearances and would be free very soon. He described his properties, his plans, and his future. He told her she was the reason he finally felt alive again. She believed him. Why would she not? He was convincing. He told essentially the same story to both of us, just from different angles with details rearranged to suit each listener. What neither of us knew was that Adrian had been telling Zara I was the problem while telling our social circle the same thing. He had cast himself as the reasonable man in the middle, trapped between a cold wife and a difficult world. His new relationship was the reward he had earned through private suffering. The irony was that both lies rested on the same foundation. And Adrian's younger sister Beezy and I had always gotten along genuinely, not just politely. She was direct and perceptive in the way people become when they spend a lifetime watching carefully. She had grown up studying her brother and understood exactly how he operated when he wanted something badly enough. Beezy had started calling me more often in the months before the gala, though she never said directly why. Our conversations stayed on safe topics: her children, my work, family updates. But she listened intently and asked quiet questions that felt connected to something larger she was trying to understand. It was Beezy who first noticed that Adrian had been telling conflicting stories to different family members. She mentioned it to me, carefully saying that certain things she had been hearing did not quite add up. I thanked her and did not say more than necessary. What I did not know then was that Beezy had also been looking into something that genuinely troubled her. She had come across a conversation in which Adrian had described me to a family relative as someone who invented problems and refused to give him peace. The description was so far from who I actually was that it alarmed her completely. She went back. 7 years before the gala, Adrian's company nearly collapsed. He had overextended on a commercial development project, the contractor had underperformed, and a key investor withdrew at the last moment. Adrian was facing debts he could not cover and deadlines he could not meet. He came to me one evening looking smaller than I had ever seen him. He sat at the edge of our bed and told me everything. I listened. Then I made a decision I never discussed with anyone. My maternal grandmother had passed away 2 years earlier, leaving me a sum of money I kept quietly in a personal account. It was not a fortune, but it was enough. I transferred it into a bridge account to stabilize his company during the crisis. I did not reveal the full source, knowing his pride would cause him to refuse. I structured it instead as a private loan from an investor I managed on paper. Companies survived. The debts were cleared. Within 18 months, Adrian had fully rebuilt his professional reputation, and from that point he described his recovery as a story of personal resilience. He never once mentioned me. I had kept every document from that transaction. Mr. Nwosu had a copy and I had a. The Winter Charity Gala preparations began 6 weeks before the event. As co-patrons of the foundation, Adrian and I were both listed on the printed program. I confirmed my attendance without emotion. I had been quietly building documentation for months. Mr. Nwosu had received the final piece of evidence he needed 10 days earlier. We had spoken twice that week. Everything was in place. What I did not know was what Adrian was planning for that evening. In the weeks beforehand, he had grown noticeably more energized. He made calls behind closed doors and took more care with his appearance. He seemed genuinely excited about something. I did not ask directly. I simply watched. 3 days before the gala, Beezy called me. She was careful with her words but said she had heard from a cousin who had spoken to one of Adrian's associates. She was not entirely certain of the details but wanted me to know that Adrian appeared to be planning something public at the event. Something designed to control a narrative before it could spread on its own. I thanked her. I told her I would be fine. After I hung up, I sat quietly for a moment. Then I called Mr. Nwosu to confirm he would. In the 2 weeks before the gala, I did 3 things quietly. First, I organized every document Mr. Nwosu and I had collected into a single bound file. Bank records, transfer histories, evidence of the bridge account connected to my grandmother's funds, a carefully built timeline with dates and amounts that told the story without needing explanation. Second, I worked with Emeka, a financial investigator Mr. Nwosu had recommended, who had been examining the unexplained transfers for 8 weeks. His report arrived on a Thursday. I read it alone with my office door closed. Confirmed what I had suspected. Adrian had been moving money into a separate holding account registered under a name I did not recognize. The amounts were significant. Third, I spoke with Fulake, a senior legal partner I had known for years who now ran her own firm. I did not formally retain her yet. I simply had a long, careful conversation about my options and what lay ahead. She told me I was better prepared than most people who came to her in similar situations. On the evening of the gala, I dressed carefully and chose the navy gown because it was controlled and elegant. Before leaving, I stood briefly in front of the mirror. The ballroom filled steadily between 7 and 8 in the evening. I moved through the crowd as I always had, greeting people warmly, asking about families and smiling at familiar jokes. Several people told me I looked wonderful. I thanked them without thought. I was watching everything carefully. I saw Adrian arrive at 8:15. He walked in with Zara beside him in a red dress. Her hand rested in the crook of his arm. Guests near the entrance looked once and quickly away. A few looked again. Social calculations had already begun around us. I was standing near the east side of the room when he entered. He saw me. For just a moment something crossed his face. Not guilt, not hesitation. More like a man confirming that a stage was properly set before a performance. He nodded at me from across the room. I nodded back and held my expression completely steady. Tension was invisible to most guests but very present to those who knew us. Conversations near us softened. Mr. Nwosu arrived at 8:30 and positioned himself near the registration table, folder in hand, in a part of the room clearly visible from where I stood. 8:50 a staff member delivered Adrian a. The room did not go quiet all at once. Conversations softened one by one as heads turned toward the center where Adrian stood, microphone in hand. He smiled broadly. He thanked the organizers. He spoke briefly about the foundation's work. People applauded politely. Then he shifted. Zara stepped forward beside him. He placed his hand on the small of her back and told the room he wanted to make a personal announcement. He said he had been living a life that no longer reflected who he truly was. After deep reflection, he had chosen to begin a new chapter. The woman beside him was that chapter, and she was carrying his child. The gentle applause that had been forming dissolved completely. Someone set a glass down on a nearby table, and the small sound was very loud in the sudden stillness. Several guests looked immediately at me. Others looked deliberately away. I did not cry. I did not move. I stood exactly where I was and looked at him across the room with the expression of a woman who had known this was coming. 'Cause I had. I had been ready for months. What surprised me was not the announcement itself. It was the sheer size of his confidence. How? Before Adrian could finish speaking, Mr. Nwosu moved. He stepped away from the registration table and walked into the center of the room with the calm of a man who needed no rehearsal. He raised one hand and announced in a voice that carried clearly without being loud that he needed to inform Mr. Adrian Hart that certain legal matters required his immediate attention. He held up the sealed leather folder. Adrian's expression changed. A tightening around the eyes, a pause in his breathing. He looked at Mr. Nwosu the way a man looks at something he thought he had already handled and now realizes he had not. Mr. Nwosu continued. He explained that the prenuptial agreement signed by both parties contained specific provisions triggered by tonight's events. He said this was not the appropriate moment for full disclosure, but that Mr. Hart would be wise to review the document before making further statements about his assets, properties, or future arrangements. The ballroom was completely still. Even the waiters had stopped. Adrian held the microphone with nothing left to say. Zara looked from Mr. Nwosu to Adrian with a new expression replacing the one she had arrived wearing. Adrian set the microphone down quietly on the nearest table. He looked. He asked for a private word. We moved to a meeting room off the side corridor, Adrian, Mr. Nwosu, and myself. Several guests pressed close to the entrance as we left, but none followed inside. Adrian closed the door. He was still composed on the surface, but I could see the tightness in his jaw. He told Mr. Nwosu calmly that whatever this was could be handled through proper channels at a more appropriate time. Mr. Nwosu agreed it was not ideal, which was precisely why he had hoped the public announcement might have been reconsidered. He placed the prenuptial document on the table, turned to the infidelity clause, and read it aloud in a steady voice. Clause activated upon documented public acknowledgement of an ongoing outside relationship. What had just occurred in the ballroom was exactly that. Adrian said there was no documented proof of anything. Mr. Nwosu then placed a second document on the table. The financial investigation summary. He explained that funds transferred from the marital account over 14 months had been traced to a separate holding account. These transfers, combined with the activated clause, significantly altered the asset picture Adrian had been assuming was secure. Adrian said quietly that I had no right to do. We returned to the ballroom about 20 minutes later. Every guest was still there. Not one person had left, which told me everything about the human instinct to remain close to something unfolding in real time. Conversations had restarted, but they were quieter and more deliberate than before. The first thing I noticed was the cluster of Adrian's business associates near the bar. 3 of his most significant investors, men I had personally introduced to him and entertained in our home, stood together. Their expressions were carefully neutral in the precise way businessmen become neutral when privately recalculating a relationship. One of them, Ola, who had backed 2 of Adrian's largest projects, approached me shortly after I re-entered the room. He greeted me warmly, then asked quietly whether I was still personally involved in managing the community development trust connected to one of their shared investments. I confirmed I was. He nodded and moved away without approaching Adrian at all. Within the hour, I learned from 2 separate conversations that questions were circulating about fund management in Adrian's most recent commercial project. Nothing formal. Just questions. Kind that arise when a man has just publicly demonstrated that his private life and finances are not what he had been presenting. Zara had not come with us to the side room. When I returned to the ballroom, I saw her near the far wall alone, holding a glass she was not drinking from. She had the expression of someone who had arrived expecting to be the most important person in the room and had just discovered the evening was about something else entirely. Later, I learned what happened during those 20 minutes. A colleague of Adrian's had been speaking nearby without realizing Zara was close enough to hear. She learned about the ownership structure of his primary company. She heard about a loan tied to property that did not fully belong to him. The version of our marriage she was now receiving bore almost no resemblance to what Adrian had told her. She had believed she was walking into a ready-made life. She had believed the apartment, the income, the investments were all cleanly his to offer. She thought the hard part was already done. She found out that evening that almost none of it was as simple as he had described. She also discovered that Adrian had told me she did not exist while telling her that I was the obstacle to his happiness. He had used both of us. Beezy arrived 40 minutes after the announcement, running late because of her youngest child's bedtime. She walked in, read the room in under 2 minutes, and came directly to my side. She did not ask what had happened. She simply stood beside me. That said more than any words could have. Later that evening, Beezy walked over to where a group of Adrian's relatives had gathered and spoke to them directly. I could not hear every word from where I stood. But after she spoke, the family's energy visibly shifted. Where there had been instinctive loyalty based on blood, there was now something quieter and more troubled. What Beezy had assembled over months of careful observation was enough to change the room. An older uncle of Adrian's approached me before the evening ended. He was a formal man, not given to displays of feeling. He took both my hands and said the family owed me more than he could express publicly. He said what Beezy had shared had significantly changed his understanding of the past several years. Then one final piece surfaced. Cousin mentioned quietly that Adrian had used a family property co-signed by his mother as collateral for a private debt no family member had approved. That news. The days after the gala were complicated in the way a storm's aftermath is complicated. Not because the damage is still happening, but because you are walking through it and measuring the full scope of what was lost. Mr. Nwosu and I met formally 3 days after the event. He laid out the legal picture clearly. Prenuptial infidelity clause had been triggered, activating asset protections in my favor, covering a significant portion of our joint property. Beyond the prenup, Emika's financial investigation supported a case for recoverable funds. Money moved from accounts containing my contributions into the separate holding account. The most significant development concerned Adrian's primary company. When I had saved it 7 years earlier using my grandmother's inheritance, Mr. Nwosu had documented the arrangement as a private loan. That loan had never been formally dissolved or converted into a gift. Under the original terms, the outstanding value directly connected to the company's survival gave me a legal claim to a controlling interest that Adrian had apparently never once thought to address. He had assumed I had forgotten, or that I would never use it. He had confused my silence with surrender, my loyalty with powerlessness, my patience with permanence. Cost of those assumptions was now being. Adrian moved quickly after the gala, the way a man moves when the ground beneath him stops feeling solid. He called mutual friends and presented a version of that evening, placing my behavior at the center of the problem. I had orchestrated public humiliation, weaponized our attorney, and spent months preparing to destroy him. He also challenged the prenuptial agreement's validity through separate legal counsel, arguing certain clauses had not been properly explained before signing. That argument lasted approximately 48 hours. His attorney then received the meeting transcript Mr. Nwosu had prepared at the time of signing. A complete record of the clauses reviewed with Adrian's signature on a separate page, confirming he had understood each one fully. The final door closed when Emeka continued working beyond his initial report. He found that a former project manager named Tola, who had resigned from Adrian's company 8 months earlier, had kept personal records of fund movement instructions he had received. Tola had not come forward before because he had not known there was reason to. Now he did. He contacted Mr. Nwosu voluntarily and submitted everything. His records showed deliberate, repeated financial redirection far beyond mismanagement. Adrian was no longer facing only a divorce. He was now facing potential formal misconduct. The formal legal meeting took place in Mr. Nwosu's office 2.5 weeks after the gala. Present were Mr. Nwosu and myself, Adrian, and his attorney, and a representative from the financial regulator's office who had taken interest in Tola's submissions. Adrian arrived looking different. His face thinner, the easy confidence of 14 years replaced by visible tightness. His attorney attempted twice to reframe the proceedings as a private marital dispute. Both attempts were set aside quickly. The misconduct issue had moved far beyond the marriage the moment Tola's records were independently verified. At one point, while documents were being reviewed, there was a long pause. Adrian looked at me across the table. It was our first direct eye contact since the ballroom. He looked like a man only now fully understanding the gap between what he had expected and what was actually happening. There was no anger left in his expression. Something closer to a slow, quiet reckoning had replaced it entirely. His attorney called a short break. During it, Zara, waiting in an adjacent room for a separate matter, apparently overheard enough to understand something Adrian had told her incorrectly about the apartment lease and a jointly titled vehicle. The sounds from that room stopped By the 4th week after the gala, the shape of Adrian's world had shifted in ways no apology could reverse. The 3 investors who had clustered near the bar that evening conducted a formal review of their positions in his projects. One withdrew entirely. The second placed conditions on continued involvement pending a full financial audit. The third stopped returning his calls. His family had not abandoned him completely. Families rarely do. But the room he stood in with them had grown smaller and cooler. Beezy did not speak to him directly for 3 weeks. His mother called me twice during that period and mostly listened. I think she simply needed to know I was all right. I told her I was, and I meant it. Zara had retained her own legal counsel. I did not involve myself in what was happening between them. I had never blamed her for choices made based on information given dishonestly. What I noticed quietly was that Adrian had begun to look like a man carrying something heavy entirely alone. The support network he had relied on, professional, financial, personal, and familial, had not collapsed all at once, but it had thinned significantly. When a network thins like that, a person finally understands how much. About a month after the gala, something unexpected happened. Fulake called me. She explained that she and colleagues had been discussing the growing demand for communication strategy consulting among organizations navigating legal and reputational transitions. She said my professional background combined with the clarity she had observed in me made her think of me specifically for this kind of independent work. She asked whether I had ever seriously considered consulting on my own. I told her I had thought about it but had never found the right moment. She asked whether the moment might be now. That same week Ola sent a formal note asking whether I would join an advisory board forming around a new urban development initiative. He did not mention Adrian. I sat with both conversations for several days. I had spent 14 years making myself useful in ways attached to someone else's name. Organizing, supporting, protecting, enabling. Most of it had been invisible in the way essential things are when they are taken completely for granted. Now, unexpectedly, people who had been watching closely enough to see the real picture were asking me what I wanted to do with my own abilities. Question felt both new and long overdue. I called Folake on a Thursday. Reconciliation was never on the table. Adrian reached out 3 times after formal proceedings began. Once through his attorney, once through Beezy, and once through a handwritten note delivered to my office. I read the note. I could see in it a man perhaps seeing things clearly for the first time. But clarity that arrives after the damage is done is not the same as the trustworthiness that should have existed long before. I did not want revenge. That had never been the point. Revenge would have meant I was still connected to him in a way that required his suffering to feel complete. I was not. Everything I had done was about protecting what was mine. My financial stability. My professional credibility. My future. Consequences he experienced were not designed by me. They were simply what happens when truth is finally given the space it was always owed. I declined all 3 approaches calmly and without bitterness. I wished him well in the only honest way available to me. Not warmly but without hatred. What I accepted instead was a quiet Saturday in my apartment 3 months after the gala, sitting with tea and a notebook writing down what I wanted the next 5 years to look like. 6 months after the Winter Charity Gala, I sat at a conference table in Folake's firm presenting a communications framework to a group of professionals who were listening carefully and taking notes. It was an ordinary morning in many ways. But I felt quietly and without drama that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The gala that was meant to replace me had instead become the night that revealed in front of everyone who mattered what the past 14 years had truly looked like. Not the polished version Adrian had been presenting to the world. The real version, with its quiet sacrifices, its private silences, and its careful preparation for a moment I had hoped would never come but had been ready for nonetheless. Adrian's business remained under formal review. Its outcome was no longer my concern. Beezy and I had dinner together the previous weekend. She told me she was proud of me. I told her she had been part of why things went the way they did, and I meant it completely. As for me, the table I sat at was mine. The work I was doing was mine. The future ahead was entirely mine. And the woman who had walked into that ballroom 6